I'm starting off with eating is a political act because I'm going to be a bit politically incorrect today. Normally I start the day by talking a lot of positives on regeneration of landscapes, soils, landscape function, healthy food, healthy people, healthy planet, which will come later. But I'm following John in setting the scene as to some of the issues that are confronting us. And I guess what's behind that I'm going to discuss is the fact that it's the ruling philosophy of leading governance and business in our modern society, which is economic rationalism, growth for the sake of growth and greed, which is driving most of the big issues that I'm going to discuss. So the questions I'm asking are, how come? How come fossil capitalism destroyed local food cultures and cuisines? And how come, under industrial agriculture, and I'll read this because some of you won't be able to see that, how come that under industrial agriculture we've destroyed local communities, farmer indebtedness is now increasing, we've destroyed agroecologies, we have nutrient-bereft food, we have soils, water, environments and food laced with many poisons. We have an epidemic of ill health. And where agriculture is a key contributor to climate change and tipping us into the Anthropocene. So that's a dramatic view of the Anthropocene. This is our blue-green. I won't go close, I'm off the black spot. That's our blue-green planet. There's only one, and it's blue-green because life itself created conditions for life. For example, bacteria about 3.2 billion years ago first put up oxygen into the atmosphere, and that process has continued until in the last 50, 60 years, where one species is now changing that whole self-sustaining system. And it's not just climate. There are basically 9 major Earth systems, all self-organised through that creation of life originally to maintain these unique conditions for life. And it's now human activity that has destabilised that. If you see what I've put there, when you look at all the evidence, the activities of industrial agriculture is one of, if not the major destabiliser in almost all those systems except the ozone hole. And just quickly, how did this come about? Well, indigenous societies and, say, medieval peasant culture was what you'd say that they had an organic mind, where people saw themselves as an indivisible part of Mother Earth. Their religious societies embedded that. They didn't see themselves as separate. The shift began with the Renaissance and then followed through the scientific, industrial, capitalist revolutions, where we moved to the situation of this mechanistic worldview where we see ourselves as separate now from Mother Earth, which under an industrial capitalist society sees Earth as a substrate from which you extract resources to make profits. That's a huge shift from that organic mind. So if you look at agriculture, say, before that shift occurs, say the beginnings of industrial agriculture, it's what you call organic, natural inputs and practices, crop rotations, recycling of nutrients, use of humus. Societies were self-contained and sufficient, by and large local, therefore with local or regional food regimes, biologically based, and it was organised to capture natural solar energy, hence the local food regimes as well. And then began the process of industrialising agriculture, which now today is typified by being fossil fuel based, energy intensive, dependence on mechanical, chemical intervention, disempowered humans and their communities through a labour-saving focus that is entirely market-driven. And as a consequence are these massive environmental and social costs, hence the Anthropocene. And just quickly, modern fertilisers really, the idea of us having to put non-natural inputs in began the late 18th, but particularly middle of the 19th century. So it really came out of Germany with people like Justus von Liebig and Sprengel, where they came up with the mineral nutrition theory, which, as the leading soil biologist in the 30s, Charles Kellogg from the USDA, summarised as their view of that was that soil is reduced to a more or less storage bin of plant nutrients. That NPK philosophy began in the 1850s and it still continues today, that we can mechanically manipulate the soil box just by adding a few nutrients. When you listen to people like Walter Yana and Phil here today, the complexity of allowing biology to drive a system, to simplify that down to adding a few things in the soil box is a radical shift. Thanks. So the steps then to industrialisation. The patenting of the first fertilisers began in the 1840s in the UK, where we got first superphosphate derivatives. And then they began to call it high farming, a central focus on inorganic chemical inputs. You know, your phosphates, and then the breakthrough industrially also occurred in 1909 when we got the Haber-Bosch system, where, and most people don't realise this, that our industrial nitrogen inputs come out from fossil fuels, over 90%, when they were able to make liquid ammonia from nitrogen in the atmosphere. And of course, World War II was a huge shift. We had the rise of America as a result of the war, and all the waste stockpiles, unused stockpiles of that ammonium nitrate, basically bombs, etc. The big multinationals were evolving and they scratched their heads, what do we do? Let's turn the stockpiles into fertiliser that we can flog for profit. And so the rise of the modern nitrogen fertiliser and superphosphate industries took off, as did the petrochemical industries. They converted the synthetic poisons, particularly developed in Germany in the First World War and then the Second World War. A lot of people don't realise a lot of the Nazi intellectual property and some of the science was brought over to the States. It's led to the modern pesticide and weedicide regimes. And so we end up with a rise of chemical agriculture and the petro-industrial complex. Told you I'm going to get the bad news out of the way so we can get to the good news later. Thanks, mate. And then we had the wonderful Green Revolution. Summarised, massive increase in food production due to all these mechanical, chemical inputs. Keep going. So that was from 1960 to 1990. And it's increasingly being viewed by a lot of people examining the story as the big con. People have won Nobel Prizes for developing it, but if you want me to be brutal, you could say it was an unconscionable campaign to spread capitalist to industrial agriculture for the mega profits to giant transnational companies, foisted by developed nations on the developing world at huge social and environmental costs. And that's not a story you hear until in the last 10 years, where that's now being unravelled in quite extraordinary detail, particularly in the, what's called the Global South, India and South America and parts of Asia. Thanks. So the cost of the big con: massive environmental costs, ecological collapse, rising modern health issues, loss of local adapted plant and animal varieties. That's huge. Places like India had thousands of species, from rice to the barleys, etc., and now a lot of them are trapped in buying patented seeds that are hybrids. So a huge dependence on hybrid seeds, chemicals, inputs, machinery, massive social upheaval, such as Indian farmer indebtedness and suicides. I'll just give you one quick example. This extraordinary, I won't get off the spot, a journalist, P. Sanath, who's a major leading journalist in India, spends about 300 days a year cataloguing the social disaster in India. 500,000 suicides in the last 10 years alone due to indebtedness to the big multinationals for hybrid seeds, chemical, machinery and all the rest of it. So I guess to summarise post-1960 global agriculture, I would say that the mega organisations, political, industrial, of fossil industrial capitalism succeeded in enshrining power and wealth via greed through three key avenues. This relates to why we've lost our local food regimes. They've done it through commodifying food. If you're a wool grower like me, fibre as well. The industrialisation of the value chain from farmer to consumer, and what's called financialisation of the value chain, which I'll touch on briefly later. So the result, and we're all aware of it, the rise of the modern corporate food regime. Food's just a bland commodity, produce as much as you can and the price drops. Thanks. So as Marion Neffel, a leading nutritionist in the States, sums that capitalism turns food, a life essential, into a commodity to be sold like any other commodity, and it makes it very cheap. That's why I started by saying today that eating is a political act. So the first colonial food regime began with the colonisation by the major European nations. In Australia it was a classic case. We produced the wool fibre for the industrial machines at Bradford, etc. But that industrialisation and population growth relied on cheap commodities, hence commodified food, which was central to that colonial capital accumulation. And that was driven through the initial ones like potatoes, rice, corn, etc. And then later the cereals, etc. And it's that capitalism that has shaped our modern food systems. And it's had a huge impact on landscapes, diet, and local cuisines, for example. Thanks. And then we come to the next phase, which is the global food regime, the one we're in now. Came after the war, as I indicated. With that growth of what's now being entrenched as the modern economic rationalist endless growth approach, the so-called free market. And as this leading food writer, Eric Holt Jimenez, who's now in Australia, says that, and he says it bluntly, the freedom for huge corporations, what free market really means, the freedom for huge corporations to produce what and where they want, import from where they want, stash profits where they want, all the while evading tax obligations and transferring huge environmental and health costs onto society, what are called the externalities. So that sums up a sort of neoliberal economic approach. And I'm no political radical, I'm just sick of watching farming being gutted and started to analyse university and post what's really going on, or what I think is going on. And the result of all this is it disempowers individuals, communities and farmers and destroys local food regimes. And so financialisation, which I mentioned before, and I'll go back one, I think, please, mate. Yeah, so the great conundrum, as Holt Jimenez says, by turning food into a commodity, farmers go broke by overproducing food in a world where 1 in 7 people go hungry in the developing world. And yet, if you look at the latest UN stats, 70% of the world's food comes off peasant farms, 5 acres and less, run on healthy agroecology processes, mainly by women, by the way. At the same time, we're wasting 30 to 40% of food. Many European and American farmers are being paid not to produce food in indirect subsidies. And this is despite centuries of capitalism and large-scale capitalist agriculture, which today is still only producing less than 30% of the world's food. So the big story we're told that we need all the chemicals, all the transnationals, I would challenge that very strongly. We can grow plenty of food without all that damaging inputs, etc. And I won't get into the state of American cropping now, if you really pull that together, look what's going on in the American cropping belt, corn, wheat, soy. Through their subsidised crop insurance program, which you'll only get that insurance if you use the right chemicals and patented seeds, etc. If you pull all the subsidies out, American cropping is making a loss. At the same time, the big suppliers, the transnational seed, chemical, fertiliser companies, they're making a $450 billion profit. How does that equation work? I won't go into the financialisation story, but it's really the huge role of financial speculation and hedging in farming that's turned even farmland into a commodity for speculation rather than a precious resource you grow food on. Thanks. And to really end up with a political statement, I would say that agribusinesses and food industries, the big ones, are capitalist enterprises. These giant oligopoly companies, chemical, pharmaceutical, petrochemical, genetic engineering, seed companies, global commodity traders, etc. Under that economic rationalist philosophy, they have to continually grow to make profits. So they've got their eye on that 70% of food that they don't yet grow or influence. And so that's a warning I'm putting out. We can do without them, and it's going to require us at the regional and local and individual level to address that. So that's why I started my talk with the question, how come all this has come about? And I'm arguing very firmly, we've been conned for the benefit of the very few. We'll go on, I think, right? And so I want to finish on a positive, because that's what most of my talks and my books are about. There are grounds for hope, because if industrial agriculture is the major cause of the Anthropocene, as I'll talk about after lunch, the very best method to approach turning around climate change and most of those other disturbed earth boundaries is regenerative agriculture, as I'll show you, work with Paul Hawken, etc. And with that goes revitalising regional, local food regimes and cuisines. And so I'd like to introduce this positive new law for us all to learn, the law of the turtle. Behold the turtle, he makes progress only when he sticks his neck out. And so very much, I hope you can understand at least when I say that eating is a political act, what is really behind that. The decisions we make hugely impacts the whole story on healthy food, healthy people, healthy planet. And so I guess as a sort of form of radical, I'm preaching what I call an underground insurgency, playing on healthy soil, yes, but it's us, individual farmers, consumers, and regions like this creating a really pioneering new food regime. We're the ones that can change. The solutions aren't going to come from the top. And I'll talk after lunch about some of those solutions. Thank you.